Welcome back. Good evening. I'll wait till you find some seats. There are seats down front. Lovely seats. Choice. It's the old rule called the last will sit first. Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome Carie Penabad and Adib CURE to the lecture platform. Tonight, Professors Penabad and CURE speak to us as the 19th Louis I. Kahn Visiting Assistant Professors, following Tom Wiscombe, who occupied the chair in fall 2012. The Kahn Visiting Assistant Professorship brings young architect educators to our school, offering them the opportunity to lead an advanced studio and, if they wish, a seminar. The work of the Kahn Assistant Professors, as well as that of their students, is then published in book form. Architecture Inserted, documenting the work of the studios led by Liza Fior and Catherine Clark of Muff, and Mimi Wang and Eric Bunge of N Architects, and Chris Perry of Servo, is the most recent entry in this book series and was recently launched in New York at the Van Allen Institute. Both Carie Penabad and Adib CURE hold the Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Miami, as well as the Master of Architecture from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Well, nobody's perfect. After finishing at Harvard in 1998, both went to work in the offices of Machado and Silvetti in Boston. In 2001, they continued together on their professional path, founding their Miami-based firm. In 2001, Professors Penabad and CURE returned to their undergraduate alma mater, joining the faculty at the University of Miami School of Architecture under Dean Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg. Penabad and CURE have also held teaching positions on the design faculties of Northeastern University and the Boston Architecture Center. Please join me in welcoming Carie Penabad and Adib CURE to Yale as they deliver the lecture In Between. Thank you.
Good evening. First and foremost, Carie and I would like to express our gratitude to Dean Robert Stern for having invited us to teach at this prestigious institution during the 2013 semester as Louis I. Kahn Visiting Assistant Professors. For us, this has been a great honor indeed. We would also like to thank, although we realize that there's still a great deal of work to be done before the end of the semester, we would nonetheless like to thank our group of students, who some of them are sitting here, most of them actually, for their hard work, dedication, for their spirit of collegiality, and most importantly, open minds. Finally, we would like to thank the Yale School of Architecture faculty and staff who have so graciously welcomed us. We have already enjoyed the many conversations over the past few months, and we look forward to a continued dialogue. Tonight, we will show you 5 projects. The first 3 projects are built works in Miami, and the last 2 projects are larger scale projects located in 2 cities in the Caribbean. This map describes both the geographic and cultural context of our work, and as you can see, Miami is at the center of the image. Miami is arguably a city in between 2 worlds, a city that when viewed from New Haven can seem like an exotic province, an outpost. And yet, when seen from the Caribbean and South America, it is a capital. It is a city located at either the edge or the center, depending on your frame of reference, and as such, it is a city that is continuously reinventing itself. And the Caribbean's cultural context, geographic circumstance, and natural setting has had a profound and often defining influence in the configuration and constitution of the city of Miami. For us, Miami also belongs to the world of the Bahamas, to the world of Jamaica. Miami belongs to the world of the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Puerto Rico, Curacao, St. Kitts. Miami also belongs to the world of Cartagena de Indias in Colombia and Havana in Cuba. So while there are certainly differences in both the natural and built landscapes of these places, the expansive skies, the vast emerald green sea, the sponge-like geology, and the fantastic flora and fauna, these are all shared phenomena. You see, for us, this is a world full of light and scorching heat that could only be painted, that perhaps could only be described with intense blues and greens. Now, the Caribbean, as described by the Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Caribbean is a place both vivid and terrible, a world of burning sun and overripe guavas with a dust-choked air that carries a smell of sleeping alligators. The Caribbean, this world of the Caribbean, is a magical world of overlapping cultures. It's where the transcendental encounter of the olive and the corn took place, and where many impulses and traditions cross each other. And this confluence produces a kind of mestizaje, a kind of blending, both in the people and in the built environment. It is a place where the Giralda Tower of Sevilla is transplanted and transformed into the centerpiece of the Biltmore Hotel in Miami, and where the formal strategies and modernist ideologies of architects such as Le Corbusier are externalized and made more exuberant in response to the climate and the culture of the place. This is the world we come from. Now, founded in 1896, Miami is a young city. A little over a century in the making and still under construction, Miami exists in a precarious line between the metropolis and the swamp, between nature and artifice, between business and leisure, myth and reality, virtue and vice. This slide depicts the geography of Miami, with Miami Beach in the Atlantic Ocean to the east and south, and the swampland, this great swampland of the Everglades to the west. There is, of course, the Miami River, running east to the expansive waters of Biscayne Bay and the place where the city was born and where currently downtown Miami begins. Up above, north of downtown, there is Little Haiti, Wynwood, the Design District, as well as Coconut Grove, Little Havana, and Coral Gables to the south. All of these making part of this mostly manufactured constellation of interconnected cities and islands that are part of our collective memory of Miami. Now, Carie and I, we both spent our formative years as young architects of architecture, as young students of architecture in Miami, and we returned there to establish our practice and pursue our teaching careers. So in a way, our personal histories are tied to the history and temperament of this place, and our own DNA lies in the Caribbean, being both Cuban and Colombian. However, while we embrace all that makes our geographic circumstance unique and vibrant, we're not blind to many of the city's shortcomings. We are fully aware that much of Miami is being built cheaply and quickly, and that little consideration is being given to the ways in which individual buildings contribute to the construction of the city. You see, for us, this discussion also involves the perhaps less glamorous and possibly even more fundamental discussion or discourse, which includes the relevance of type, the composition of streets, the notion of permanence, the idea of craft, and dare we say, the pursuit of beauty. So when Carie and I were asked to give this lecture, and when reflecting upon our own work for this presentation, we began to realize that, well, we in fact have been on a constant search to root our buildings in a culture of place, and that ultimately we find inspiration in both the vernacular and the academic, in the ancient and the contemporary, in the commonplace and the extraordinary. And perhaps due to our own reality, we're able to coexist rather comfortably in these two seemingly opposed worlds. We are open to finding beauty in differences and are always drawn to what makes a place unique. As a result, we're constantly asking ourselves, what is it that is culturally resonant about this place, and how can the work reflect this? So it is our hope, in a way, that the following projects that we will show you this evening will illustrate the ways in which we have begun to answer these questions along the way. So the first project that we will show you is titled Oak Plaza. This project, Oak Plaza, is located within an 18-block neighborhood just north of downtown Miami. This area, as many of you who are familiar with the city must know, this area was long forgotten during the periods when suburban sprawl became the standard pattern of growth in the city. But it is now, in the last few years, it's been experiencing a dramatic urban renewal. Today, the neighborhood is referred to as the Design District, and along with nearby Wynwood, this part of the city has become the home of leading designers. It has become the home of leading artists, galleries, showrooms. And as you know, this is also the place, by the way, where parts of Art Basel take place every year during the month of December. And yet, when one walks through the neighborhood, when one quickly realizes that it is still missing the necessary elements needed to create a truly vibrant place. So as you make your way through, as you walk through the streets, you realize that the place is still missing adequate housing, it's still missing infrastructure, and as significant perhaps, is missing public space. Therefore, the challenge for us became how to define a sense of place in an environment that lacked any clear architectural or urban definition. And we believe that, that this could be done by the clear sculpting of architectural form, both at the level of the architecture, but also at the urban scale. Now, this image shows the location of the site with the large arrow pointing to it. And it also shows the only other public spaces, here shaded in pink, in the entire area, including downtown Miami, in a way also showing you the lack of public spaces in the city. Now, the existing site was a typical Miami underdeveloped asphalt parking lot. But within it, within the site, stood a sublime landscape of mature white oaks, a beautiful stand of white oaks, some of which were over 100 years old, in fact, older than the city itself. And so, from the beginning, our desire was to preserve this small remnant of the native Florida landscape, of the native Florida hammock, that was so exceptional within the district, and we felt was also exceptional within the city as a whole. But in addition, we also wanted to properly define a true center for the area by creating the first public plaza in the neighborhood. Now, the existing site, the site that we had to work with, was located within a large rectangular block situated west of Biscayne Boulevard and north of the highway. Biscayne Boulevard, highway, that's the site. So in addition to a new plaza, the project includes the design of a new street, which in our view would allow pedestrians to bisect the length of the existing block and perhaps begin to further animate the street life of the neighborhood. In pink, on the image, we're showing you the new buildings that we proposed. In the slightly lighter pink, shaded pink building on the left-hand side is actually by another office, and I'll explain that in a moment. And in white, we are showing you the public spaces, including the new plaza and the small street. Now, something that may be interesting to explain is that the design of the small street provided an unprecedented moment for collaboration. We say this because the client, in this case the client is a developer, Craig Robbins from Docker Development. When he first hired us, he also hired another firm. And he hired these two firms to develop buildings on the other side of the street. However, rather than working in isolation, we chose to establish a dialogue, a kind of urban conversation, in the belief that if we were able to structure similarities within the urban realm, we would then be able to create a more perhaps memorable street section, a section that would be in striking contrast to the immediate context within this neighborhood, which often lacks urban continuity. So essentially, each of the buildings developed a similar architectural element, which included a repetitive base system that organized the covered arcades at street level, as well as open loggias on the upper story of the primary facades, as you can see in the sketch on the left-hand side, a similar palette of materials, which included smooth stucco surfaces for the primary building elements, and in some cases, colored cement tiles for some architectural details. And generally speaking, what we developed was a kind of a strategy for a coherent lighting and streetscape design, which we thought would enable us to heighten the visual unity of the streets. Now, returning to the plaza, which was always for us the heart of the project, we transformed the existing parking lot into an urban carpet of Caribbean euleric limestone. Now, the use of euleric limestone was for us very important because this is a material that we thought would connect the site to its geological region, to the area of Miami, but also to the Caribbean. But it would also connect the project to Miami's public building tradition. So, well, on the other hand, the edges of the new space were defined by a thin bar building and loggia. And there and here in this image, we see them fused together as a single building, these two. We believe that this continuous urban wall would allow us to create frontages along the new space and the adjacent streets. Now, something important to mention is that both the form and placement of the thin bar building and the loggia resulted from the highly constraining and reduced space that we had to work with given the location of the existing large oak trees on the site. And so we literally developed a scheme that relied on thinness. Therefore, and almost inevitably, the building developed as an L-shaped building in plan that both configured the space of the plaza with a coherent urban geometry and also provided spaces for retail and leisure. Now, this early sketch shows our initial ideas of developing this single building that addressed the street and the plaza, becoming both, in a way, urban infill as well as liner. And it also addresses different scales of events associated with each. So, for example, in the case of the narrow door that you see in the far right of the sketch, along the main street, this door is both proportion and scale to that event, while the 50-foot-long bench, which eventually would become integrated within the loggia, was scaled to the plaza and also to the view of downtown Miami beyond. And when it came to the design of the actual building, we employed Miami's vernacular. We felt that it was appropriate to work mostly with concrete block and steel trowel stucco construction, both in the end, in a way, cladding most of the building, most of the final surfaces with a brilliant glass mosaic tile. And the references for the tile cladding are also in a way associated with figurative traditions that can be seen throughout the tropics, but also the design district itself, since from the beginning we always thought that the elevations of the building should be understood as permanent urban paintings or urban murals, let's say. But we also used tile because we were aware that either in the Caribbean or in the distant landscapes of Thailand, for example, tile has been used in the cladding of buildings throughout the tropics. And this, for us, made a great deal of sense, since these tiles provide an ideal skin for these tropical buildings. Also, in the design of the elevations, the gradations of colored tile we thought would generate a rhythm of changing effects, which results in a kind of dematerialization of the building's surface. We think that while these facades cannot be classified as lightweight curtain wall, in our minds they do constitute a kind of free facade insofar as the visual quality of the surface is seen kind of independent of the wall's tectonic conditions. Furthermore, as I just mentioned, we believe that the intense use of color and the reflective quality of the material would allow the buildings to be both cleansed by the incessant rains and protect themselves from the strong light of the tropics, a light that most of you know could be very violent sometimes, and it bleaches and weathers its buildings in this region rather quickly. Now, at close range, Oak Plaza's building facades, most of them are composed of 3/4-inch glass mosaic tiles, which are arranged incrementally in 1 foot by 1 foot sheets. We thought that this assembly would resemble a kind of pointillist painting which when viewed from close up may be indiscernible, but when seen from a distance merges small increments of concentrated color into a recognizable image. Again, in the end, the urban mural is intended to act as a form of public display, a public painting that plays upon the area's primary functions as an art district, as a kind of design district, of course. And here, in this image, we see one of the primary elevations facing the plaza, with the view of the loggia on the far left and the relationship of the trees of the landscape to the building. Now, the color and tactility of surface that we were pursuing in these elevations are also pursued in the details of the paving throughout the project. We designed the floors with different textures, but also, while working with the stonemasons on the field, we became interested in exploring different ways of cutting and installing this Ulitic limestone. We became interested, for example, in the subtle differences of stone sizes, shapes, and even color. So in some areas we use Florida keystone, while in others we use Dominican shellstone, the shellstone being denser and perhaps a little more pink than the keystone. And we did this in order to make subtle differences and define different areas of the plaza and adjacent spaces. We also, as you can see in the image on the right of this slide, we were also interested in how the building turned the corner, in part because we knew that the stone and the tile both would be highly exposed in this urban corner. So we developed a tight curve for both, and in the case of the stone, we had it cut as a single piece in order to give it more strength and not really to reveal its true thickness. but still giving preference to the streets by way of the articulation of the base as it meets the ground, as it meets the sidewalk. And these are details of the same, the base, the stone base, and the tile in sketches and build form as it turns some corners, in this case, as it goes back and meets thresholds and doors. In the end, well, relatively small in scale, this project taught us great lessons. But also, we think that in a place like Miami, a city that is often defined by disrespectful, nondescript structures, a city with buildings that rarely strive to create memorable streets or public spaces, we wanted for the project to offer a distinct and coherent urban architecture, an architecture that would ultimately illustrate our fundamental belief that architecture is first and foremost a civic art. Now, this next project that we'll show you engages a different scale of building on a site which is far from Oak Plaza. In fact, it's on the opposite end of the city. The project is called MDO. And MDO, this project is located one lot south of Tamiami Trail, otherwise known as Southwest 8th Street, which is here shown with the long pink line running along the center of the map, Southwest 8th Street. 8th Street, or Calle Ocho, as it's known to most people in Miami, is one of Miami's main streets, and it runs east-west across the city. The street connects, again, the great swamp of the Everglades on the far west, with downtown, the mouth of the river, and the bay on the east. The circle along the line indicates the site where the building is located. Now, this plan shows the immediate context of the project. This view is actually the immediate context of the project. Here, the project site is highlighted in color and is shown as defined, as you can see, and perhaps even surrounded by countless strip shopping malls and speculative office buildings. And something which is important, that typical of this area of Miami, most of these buildings are set a great distance away from the main roads in the kind of infinite need to accommodate extensive surface car parking lots. The image also shows the manner in which the site backs up against a canal, one of the many bodies of water that cross through the city, but it also, of course, shows the relationship between, or the location of the building adjacent to 8th Street. And this kind of diagonal relationship of the building to 8th Street became a very important issue for us to deal with, and actually informed the way in which the building was designed. Now, 8th Street is one of those American roads that we all know, right? Where commercial signage dominates the landscape, and where the signage is cleverly designed, both in scale and placement, to be seen not only from the sidewalk, but most importantly from the car. The result, of course, is a cacophony of structures emblematic of Miami's bleak suburban landscape. Now, we should also mention that we began this project, we started working on this building at the beginning of the Great Recession. And from the onset, from the very beginning, we had to confront the challenges of a limited budget. We had to confront a less than optimal site, perhaps, a stringent zoning and building code, and a builder that had already been selected. So perhaps you may be asking, why would you ever engage in such a project? And frankly, we asked ourselves this very question many times. And yet we took it on. We took it on primarily because we found common ground with an unconventional client, a client who was interested in developing a building to redefine their retail brand, and in so doing, transform their existing context. Needless to say, we also took it on because we understand that one cannot underestimate the importance of the client in the development of a young architectural practice, and that architects need patrons, and we need them to be able to execute our ideas. But also, as many of you know, finding them and nurturing them is an elusive, lifelong pursuit. But in a way, we also took it on because Carie and I wanted to engage a real and not an idealized Miami Main Street, with the aim really to confront the aesthetic challenge of working within the quotidian commercial landscape, recomposing and transforming the elements of the commercial vernacular, including signage, commercial shopfronts, the suburban lawn, and even the painted asphalt that covers most of the city's streets. So as you can see on this site plan, this image, the proposed project immediately reverses the typical urban patterns of the area by pressing the building close to the street and placing the surface parking lot for the cars along the rear of the property. The plan is composed, this is a first and second floor plan. The plan is composed of a principal double volume retail space whose 55-foot span is bridged using concrete double T's. Now, these double T's are a standard for long span parking garages as well as office buildings in the area. And the plan's thickened wall, these post-shed walls that you see, are lined with stacked rows of merchandise. In this case, mostly men's suits, which are placed around the main space in the front of the building, while most of the services and office space and some other rooms, such as changing rooms and so on, are placed in the rear as well as in the second floor, a level above. Now, in section, the heightened volume is an intentional shift in scale. Would be an unexpected spatial experience for the area. This is an area which is mostly, of course, defined by low 8-foot ceilings, which are typically stacked one above the other. The section also shows our concern with the idea of the notion of the manipulation of daylight. And so we chose to flood the building with natural light and converting the strong, direct natural light typical of Miami into a soft, indirect ambient light. This, of course, is in direct opposition to the somewhat cavernous, artificially lit interiors, which are typical of these adjacent buildings, malls, and office parks nearby. Now, the skylights also provided us with an opportunity to hide some of the mechanical systems needed, such as electrical systems as well as air conditioning systems. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is a sketch drawn with gouache and Prismacolor. The project started at the beginning of the recession, and therefore, and almost by necessity, we were obliged to explore an architecture of scarcity. And so we developed a language of abstraction and restraint, where the range of materials and compositional moves were limited to a few carefully selected elements. One of the most prominent of these elements is a 10-foot diameter metallic sign, which is placed perpendicular to the building's front facade. We thought that by removing this sign from the clutter of much of the signage that punctuates the existing road, 8th Street, in setting this sign against a mute blank wall, this blank wall would provide a neutral backdrop. And so an element that would otherwise be ordinary in this context would immediately, we thought, become special, perhaps even extraordinary. In addition, the front, as you can see in this image, the front elevation is inflected in order to compose a 12-foot high glass for the shop front and to produce a much needed recessed space that protects the visitor from rain or sun upon entry. But also, we thought that would imbue the building with a degree of corporality, with a degree of solidity, which would be, again, in sharp contrast to the persistent thinness of the adjacent buildings. Now, the south elevation, this is a drawing of the south elevation, has only one opening. In this case, it's a large circular window that brings light into a small meeting space within the building, facing the side entrance into the parking area in the rear. Now, here, once again, we wanted to produce an illusion of thickness. So we poured a deep circular concrete window and pressed the glass deep into the space of the opening. And this recess, we thought, would produce a more dramatic shadow on the exterior, in the southern elevation. It would also serve to further highlight the compositional difference between this window and those of the surrounding context, as well as reframing, let's say, the surrounding landscape as one stands looking out from within. Now, the rear facade was conceived quite differently. The rear facade, we understood it to be the most utilitarian of the elevations. So this is the one that collects and composes the generic inventory of elements of the surrounding context, and the repertoire is all there. The outswinging casement windows, the downspouts, the concrete eyebrows, the thickly applied color asphalt for the ground, and its corresponding painted signage, all composed as a straightforward, symmetrical facade that registers, in this case, both the first and upper levels, and in a kind of intentional domestic scale. While this view in view of the interior shows the high space of the main room, with the more compressed area of the changing rooms and service areas beyond, and the elliptical mezzanine level window where the owner's office is located. Now, this window, which the owner always wanted from the beginning, in order to be able to see the front of the entrance of the building, this window allows him to have a direct view of the main entrance and the space below. And it's here literally designed as an eye, literally looking down. And this is a detailed view of the signage as it was finally executed and designed to be viewed from either 8th Street, Calle Ocho, or the perpendicular street from Calle Ocho. And it also shows the thin cap that literally was designed minimally to terminate the top profile of the building, but also to kind of articulate the building as it meets the sky. And these are views of the building, both by day and night, as one approaches it from 8th Street on the right or from the street perpendicular to it, and enters into the parking space. And then lastly, a view from 8th Street. And this is a view that we think best represents the project, showing, in this case, the building currently standing as a silent and rather perhaps enigmatic white box, and here set in sharp contrast to the chorus of loud voices and gestures of its surrounding urban scene.
So now we're going to have a change in project and a change in voice. I'm going to present the remaining 3 projects. And this next project is, I think, quite different than the first 2 that Adib just presented. The project involved the restoration and completion of a historic house located within Coral Gables, Florida. Coral Gables is located just south of downtown Miami. And it was developed by George Merrick, who was a developer who, in an extraordinary way, also happened to be a poet. And he was responsible for planning out one of America's first garden cities. Merrick wanted to create a sense of place by producing an architecture that could imbue his young city with a sense of history. And to do this, he conceived of the idea of an American Mediterranean. And so the early architecture of Coral Gables borrowed directly from these alluring images of distant cities, most notably Spain and Italy. And these references were transformed to reflect the realities of the local building culture. These buildings, as seen here, were set in a lush tropical landscape, a landscape which is probably one of the most memorable aspects of the city. Now, within this predominantly Mediterranean-inspired architecture, Merrick also decided to introduce a number of villages, planned villages, in fact, in a number of different styles, because he believed that this would provide greater architectural diversity for the city. Our clients, a painter and a South African filmmaker, purchased one of the smallest houses in the Dutch South African village, which is the southernmost village seen here on the map. This is a close-up view of the Dutch South African village. It is a collection of houses located on a triangular parcel of land immediately adjacent to Lejeune Road, which is one of the principal north-south streets in the city. You can see it here. The original houses were designed by Marion Sims Wyeth just prior to the devastating hurricane of 1926. Wyeth himself was a talented New York architect who is probably best known for the work that he did in Palm Beach. In the case of the Dutch South African village, Wyeth modeled the architecture of the village on 17th and 18th century farmhouses that were built by the Dutch colonists in Cape Town, South Africa. We were charged with the task of restoring and completing probably the smallest house in the village. And our project, as always, began with research and documentation. And we had to produce a complete set of working drawings of the existing house. But in fact, this turned out not to be enough, because by the time that we were commissioned to do the house, most of the salient architectural characteristics were already stripped away. So we needed to extend our documentation beyond the house itself to include the documentation of important architectural details seen throughout the village, like original doors, windows, profiles, tiles. I would say that we were acting a bit like architectural archaeologists of sorts, trying to reconstruct the profiles and details of the original in an effort to first and foremost educate ourselves, but also to be able to educate the future contractor or builder. Because what you have to keep in mind is most of the local builders in the area have in fact lost the knowledge of how to restore these historic details. During the 1920s, the writer and leading Florida conservationist Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who is best known for her work The River of Grass, where she wrote about the Everglades, poetically described the architectural characteristics that defined Coral Gables' residential architecture. She spoke of the discrete elements that gave these houses their charm, including the undulating surfaces of the stuccoed walls that she said were capable of catching and reflecting the intense Florida sunlight, clay roof tiles that created a rich watercolor-like pattern ranging from rust to pale greens, lime-based paints that gracefully weathered under the Florida sun, and finely crafted wood windows and balconies that were capable of opening up the houses to the prevailing breezes. When Adib and I read Stoneman Douglas' text, her words resounded with us, because it was these very same characteristics that were systematically being stripped away from most of the houses being restored within the city today. Natural materials are always being replaced by synthetic ones that lack the craft and, I would say more importantly, the sensorial qualities of the original. And this reality, this very small reality, in fact, is changing the character of the streetscape and ultimately of the neighborhood. So for us, this project was about working slowly and paying close attention to those small things that we believe make a world of difference, particularly when they are repeated time and time again in the building of the fabric of the city. This is the plan of the house. It's quite simple. As you can see, the building is an L-shaped structure that presses itself against the street with a drive to the south that ends in a cottage, and the remainder of the site is left over for a garden. As I mentioned earlier, we restored the original house, and we added a number of additions that had been originally proposed by Marion Sims Wyeth, but never completed. These included a small front stoop, seen here at the rear, this kind of rear porch, an attachment to the cottage, a small plunge pool, and a bench that served to end the access from the porch and then screen the necessary mechanical system. The stoop literally means an elevated step, and it is one of the most important elements of the Cape Town homestead. It can take the form of an uncovered elevated terrace or a vine-covered pergola, or in some instances, a covered porch supported by masonry piers. These stoops are often incorporate masonry benches in order to promote rest and leisure. Here you see a restored partial elevation of that stoop, and to the right are some of the references that we were using as a kind of as precedents to be able to restore the house. This is a view of the completed stoop seen from the interior. The half-open Dutch door frames the space with the new bench along the rear wall. Marion Sims Wyeth's drawings included designs for these stoops, and we took these drawings as a point of departure, researching the constructive details of 17th and 18th century South African homesteads in order to be able to properly detail the construction. So we willfully completed the additions in the manner of the original, blurring the seams between the existing and the new. And we did this because we believe that this was the appropriate way to bring back this particular work to a level of completion and architectural wholeness. I have to say that throughout the entire project, the words of our teacher, Vincent Scully, kept resounding in our heads. Scully was on the faculty at the University of Miami while Adib and I were undergraduates there. And like at Harvard, he inspired generations of students. In his lectures, he would occasionally point out
Like
that—
at Yale, not at Harvard.
I stand corrected. At Yale.
Oh my God.
So in his lectures, he would occasionally point out that architects needed to know when to shout and when to be silent. So his words resurfaced here for us, and in this project, Adib and I became comfortable with a certain degree of architectural anonymity. These are two views of the completed exteriors, with the cottage at the rear, The references for these cottages come from a variety of South African rural buildings that were constructed actually by Malaysian craftsmen who could skillfully manipulate complex curvilinear surfaces. So in Miami, we did not find the Malaysian craftsmen, but we did work with a talented group of Cuban plasterers from Havana who skillfully developed these rudimentary tools that would allow us to sculpt the plaster details. And they experimented endlessly with the composition of the stucco until we could get a mix that was capable of building up the decorative details. This attention to detail was also given to the design of the custom hardware for the house, and it was inspired by traditional South African hardware details, but transformed to the particulars of the contemporary residence. The interiors were conceived in a restrained black and white palette. Ebony stained wood floors and steeply pitched wood ceilings, seen here in the living room, contrast against the undulating white surfaces of the interior plastered walls. This palette extended itself to the selection of objects for the interior, including all the furniture and the artwork. And we worked closely with the clients to develop the interiors. For us, the interiors bring together tradition and modernity, setting the work of contemporary Dutch designers such as Martin Bass and Marcel Wanders, alongside examples of traditional South African folk art. It is a world where the old and the new can comfortably coexist, and this is an affinity that resounded with us and with our clients. This is a final view of the completed elevation seen from the main road. The small house is set behind a fantastic oak tree and a gnarly sea grape that signals that the ocean is close by. And if the final image of MDO shows that building in stark contrast to its surrounding fabrics, here you might drive by and never really know that we were there. This next project is a competition entry that we produced for the design of a series of new public spaces for Barranquilla, Colombia's historic city center. The image is a book cover of an academic publication that we produced some time ago. The painting is by the local artist Noé León, and it depicts a riverboat cruising along the Magdalena River. We chose this image for the cover because we love the image, but also because Barranquilla's proximity to the Magdalena River has largely defined its destiny. Barranquilla is a city with little recorded history, very different than nearby Cartagena de Indias, which was founded in the 16th century by the Spanish following the typical patterns of colonial settlement. Barranquilla developed informally, sometime during the mid-17th century. The early settlers established a small village on the highest point of the river delta, which is approximately here. And this map shows you not only the Magdalena River, which ends at the Caribbean Sea, but the ways in which the contemporary city has built itself to the west over gently sloping hills. Decades of suburban sprawl resulted in the abandonment of the city center and a slow process of urban and architectural degradation. So today, the city center is overrun by retail that generally occupies the first and sometimes the second stories of the buildings, with the upper floors largely vacant. There is a dramatic lack of public open space. Even the most historic plaza, which is the Plaza San Nicolás seen here, was overrun by informal markets that had consumed the principal gathering spaces. When Adib and I read the brief for the competition, we were struck by the omission of any discussion regarding one of the greatest challenges facing the redevelopment of the city, and that's this. For those of you who are not familiar with Barranquilla, these are Barranquilla's raging arroyos. I guess they can be described as urban waterways that take with them everything in their path, and they cause great harm, obviously, to the city and its inhabitants. Now, Adib was familiar with this phenomena because he had grown up in Colombia. But I learned of it and terrified, I experienced it for the first time when we were mapping Barlovento, which is an informal settlement immediately adjacent to the city center. I'm going to segue here for just a moment to say that for the last several years, Adib and I have been mapping informal settlements in the global south. And we began in sites as far away as Cape Town and Mumbai. But more recently, we've concentrated our efforts closer to home, not only because it's much easier to get there, but also because we speak the language, and so it gives us greater access to the cultural context in which these settlements take place. Now, we've been interested in drawing these settlements to try to understand them as architects and as urban designers. We believe that these cities are vernacular expressions of a given culture that are worthy of study. We've mapped over a dozen settlements from the overall urban fabric seen here, and in this case, they're all drawn at exactly the same scale to make the comparison easier to analyze. But we are also, we've also studied down to the individual house to try to see what are the differences between these settlements, and also if there are any unifying themes that can unite them from place to place. Now, we're not blind to the challenges of these cities, but we do believe that alongside the challenges, they do have lessons to teach us. I wanted to present this here because this is an instance where our academic work has overlapped with our practice, one informing the other. And this is perhaps the great benefit of the teacher-practitioner model that Adib and I have been pursuing. So returning to Barranquilla, and specifically to Barlovento, which is that informal settlement immediately adjacent to the historic city center, seen here. This light gray is actually the edges of the historic city center. What did we learn from this place? Unlike the formal city, Barlovento has figured out a way to deal with the arroyos. The community got together and they actually built this canal, which actually redirects those massive waters that are coming from the historic city center towards the Magdalena River. And that simple reality saves Barlovento every year from destruction, in fact. On the other hand, the city center has no adequate way of managing that large amount of water runoff, and it is built over most of its natural gullies with no storm water drainage system. When we asked the planning officials about this, they seemed entirely unfazed. In fact, they compared their arroyos with severe New England snowstorms. They said to us, well, don't those paralyze the North American city for days? And that was the end of it. But we returned to Miami and we felt the responsibility of mapping these arroyos. And so we set out to try to map the worst arroyos in the cities and to see whether or not there was any way to overlap that map with the development of the public spaces. And what we learned was that this arroyo seen here in blue, which is one of the worst in the cities, happens to actually cross two of the spaces that they wanted us to consider, one here at this end and then one along the far end here. And so what we decided to do was to add a sixth space to the design composition that would allow us to deal with this phenomena. This is a plan of the proposed spaces located within the boundaries of the historic city center, seen here in the darker gray. You can discern the edges of the original settlement, slightly more medieval fabric here. And these are the existing spaces that the competition brief asked us to consider. What we did is we added this new paseo, which goes from the western edge of the city, Calle Murillo, all the way to Paseo Bolívar, which is this street here. This is the most important north-south street in the city, which actually ends on the Plaza San Nicolás, which is the most important and historic plaza. And by introducing this new paseo, we would introduce another primary east-west road that conveniently ended in, again, the Paseo Bolívar and that important plaza. By doing that, we could dramatically increase the public space and also deal with the question of that water runoff. A number of common themes united or surfaced for us in the design of the spaces. We were interested in sculpting clearly defined streets or urban rooms. We were keenly aware of the climatic conditions of the place. Barranquilla is extremely hot, so much so that it makes Miami seem temperate. So if you're going to be able to experience and thrive in the urban realm, you have to find ways to protect yourself from the sun. So we were interested in developing an architecture with arcades and loggias and terraces and ways to mitigate from interior and exterior. But we were also interested in employing natural landscape. landscape that could grow in the region with very, very little maintenance. The intense light also played into our thoughts for the selection of materials. We wanted to use resilient materials for the development of the public realm, including stones that we felt were capable of weathering this intense light. And finally, I would say we were searching for inspiration in popular culture and even local building traditions in a way of trying to create a public realm that could be reflective of this place. So I'm going to just quickly show you some of the images that we produced for the competition. This is actually an image for the new Paseo that I mentioned earlier. As you can see, it's a new pedestrian boulevard that is lined with street-level arcades and infill buildings wherever we could infill within the fabric. There was vehicular traffic that lines either edges of the Paseo, and we employed two scales of landscape. A broad, low acacia, which is native to the region, that provides ample public shade, and then the taller palms that you see here at the edges. And these, in our mind, march like soldiers down the street at the scale of the boulevard. And in time, would create a legible green line within the cityscape as they would rise higher than most of the surrounding fabric. The Paseo's floors were designed as an intricate pattern of caliza stone and granite that radiate from the trunks of the acacia trees. These are inspired by the patterns of the local textiles, and we felt that it was a moment of heightened detail that would allow us to set the public realm in sharp contrast to the more ordinary concrete sidewalks and concrete surfaces that line the city. This is an image for the Paseo, or the new plaza at the end of the Paseo. Here we proposed a new museum for the carnival that acts as an urban gateway to the city. This particular plaza can be used throughout the year, but we imagined it being used during the time of the carnival when they dance and they have the comparsas, and all in the days that are leading up to the carnival. The programming of this building was significant for us, as the carnival is one of the most important cultural events in the city. Today, the museum lies outside the city center, and we felt if we could place it back within the city center, we would be promoting the idea that the arts should be present along the commercial development of the city if it truly wants to create a rich urban environment. The Plaza del Hospital, which is at the southern end of the Paseo Bolívar, is basically flanked by the existing Hospital of Charity. We redesigned the plaza and proposed a new school across the street that includes retail at grade and the functions of the classrooms above. For the south-facing elevation, we developed a deep loggia with a patterned screen that protects the interior from the harsh light. The ground is detailed with stripes of brilliantly colored concrete that are inspired by the colorful hammocks of the region. This was the most modest of the plazas that they asked us to look at, and probably the best defined urbanistically. So here we simply employed, once again, two scales of landscape, the palms along the perimeter, and almond trees at the lower level, closer to the plaza, as a way of providing ample shade, because underneath the almonds is a large pedestrian bench that collects the kind of current disparate benches that are located throughout the site. This is the Plaza San Roque, which is located immediately adjacent to the Church of San Roque. The roof is the most distinctive element of this proposal, and it is cantilevered from an L-shaped bar of program that houses the seminary and additional retail program within it. The floor here, once again, is designed in varying patterns of yellow and gray, with urban furniture and a large statue of St. Rocco, which is the patron saint for the city. Finally, the Plaza San Nicolás, previously the Plaza de Colón, is the oldest plaza in the city and the space around which the original development or the original settlement was developed. Our first desire was to reopen the streets that once surrounded the plaza so we could better connect the existing space to the surrounding fabric. We divided the plaza into two zones, a heavily landscaped space in front of the church and a smaller triangular plaza to one side. Once again, you see the use of the yellow and gray floor patterns of caliza stone and granite that we felt tied this space to the others of the proposal. We proposed the use of pink oaks for the main space for two reasons. It is the emblematic tree of the city, And it is striking for obvious reasons because of its intense color, but it is also incredibly rugged and capable of withstanding the harsh climate. This is the last project that we will show you tonight, and it involves the design of a large corporate headquarters for a sugar mill in southern Guatemala. The project is currently under construction, and it has allowed us to confront the challenges of designing a large public building. The client brief provoked us to think about the ways in which a building can change the culture of a company and impact the way in which we communicate. The project is located within Guatemala's lowlands. This is a flat coastal landscape where sugarcane fields rise more than 6 feet. To the north is Guatemala City and the extraordinary Agua and Acatenango volcanoes, and to the south is the Pacific Ocean. This is largely a semi-tropical environment with a cycle of hot and very humid, dry and wet seasons that tend to produce areas of great flooding. Our clients are the owners of the sugar mill seen here to the right. Is it the right? Yes, it is the right. And they approached us with the desire to create a building that could express the company's collaborative and creative spirit. Now, I should explain that in recent years, the company has been experiencing rapid growth, and it has been building a series of structures or ad hoc structures throughout the farm to house the different departments. Now, the problem with this way of working is that they are developing a spatial and physical layout which is fragmented, and it causes a breakdown in communication. Individuals that are working on similar projects rarely see one another, and so the possibility of chance encounters or even informal conversations is very limited. Our clients wanted us to reverse this reality by designing a single building for them that was capable of accommodating all of their employees under one roof. Our first step, as it always is to research and gather information. So we began to research office spaces throughout history, beginning with the Uffizi, through post-war American corporate models, and ending in post-social networking spaces, such as the headquarters for Facebook. What we examined were the physical characteristics of each project, as well as the relationship between the individual and the collective spaces in the building. What we generally discovered was that companies that promoted creative, collaborative work generally gave less individual desk space to their workers. In turn, though, they often provided a greater amount of shared space where these chance encounters or group meetings could occur. This research also gave us empirical knowledge regarding the sizes of elements of the work environment. For instance, Citibank headquarters, which is a canonical example of the cubicle, gives each of its employees approximately 9 square meters, and in turn, it offers very little communal spaces on each floor. Now, this spatial model tends to encourage individuals to stay at their desks and perform their tasks independent of others. It also establishes a clear hierarchy between the workers and the directors, with higher-ranking officials lining the perimeter of the building with independent offices that are given direct sunlight. On the other hand, companies like Lego or Facebook offer between 3 to about 6 square meters per desk, which is dramatically less than the previous example, but they offset this by creating a substantial amount of communal spaces where creative ideas can be generated by groups or even individuals. While compiling this research, we had to not only come to terms with the particulars of the work environment, both from the overall space down to the individual desks as seen here, but we had to come to terms with how large the actual principal workspace would be. And this seems like a fairly straightforward piece of information, probably something that the client would provide you up front, but in fact it turned out to be much more difficult to determine. Because as I mentioned earlier, the current company has about 150 individuals, but they're quickly growing. So the number of employees isn't fixed, it's actually a moving target. Beyond figuring out how many new people they wanted to hire, the clients turned around to us and asked us perhaps a more fundamental question. They wanted to figure out whether or not an ideally sized working environment existed. When did someone feel part of a community, and when had it gotten too large that the networks of communication begin to break down? So I have to admit that Adib and I felt like fish out of water regarding these questions. I mean, after all, we were architects. We were not anthropologists or psychologists, even though these skills are particularly helpful in private practice. But what we were clear about was that we had hit an impasse. We could not advance if we could not determine how many people would be housed in the building. So we set out to try to help the clients make this decision. I'm going to apologize in advance for anyone in the audience who has a degree in anthropology or psychology. So needless to say, we are novices. But we did want to share this information with you, and perhaps particularly with the students, because we feel that as architects, you need to be resourceful and inquisitive. And more importantly, you need to find proactive ways to advance a project. So finding this information, or finding information that could assist our clients in making a decision, became our immediate goal. We came across the work of British anthropologist Robin Dunbar. Dunbar believes that a single individual can maintain a stable, socially cohesive group with somewhere between 100 and 230 people, but he sets his ideal number at 150. Now, he tests this hypothesis with observable group sizes for humans throughout the ages, starting with Neolithic farm villages and tribal villages, which he found that once they reach about 150, they would break off into another village. Or the basic unit size of professional armies in the Roman antiquity, or in modern times since the 16th century. Now, these, of course, are groups that rely on close collaboration, not only for work, but for survival. There are instances where the unit needs to often work as a single entity. More recently, anthropologists H. Russell Bernard and Peter Kilworth took Dunbar's number as a point of reference, but then they did a number of field studies in the United States, and they developed an increased number of 290 with a median of 231. And they attributed this increase to technological advances, our digital age that provides dramatically different ways for us to communicate and build social and working networks. So what did we do with this information? We actually presented it to our clients, and of course this generated much debate. And while they did not agree on a number immediately, the research did allow them to set more fixed parameters for the discussion. And within several weeks, they had determined that they would design the building for a maximum of 290 employees, so the Kilworth model. Now, the degree to which this is scientifically accurate is difficult to assess, but needless to say, we had found a fixed number to work with, and now we could actually begin to design. The main building seen here in the model is located within a well-defined precinct that is edged by a continuous perimeter wall with a series of gardens. It is precisely oriented to the cardinal points of the compass. This manner of orienting buildings in this region dates back to pre-Columbian, even Mayan civic building traditions. The building's long axis, which is aligned here east and west, allows us to place it parallel to the main road, while providing us an opportunity to establish the main entry on the north-south axis, which allows us to frame a direct view to the volcanoes beyond. This is the site plan, where you can see the project surrounded by the sugarcane fields to the north and to the west, with the current company's set of buildings seen here to the south. We think the project could be described in three parts: the plinth, the wall, and the roof. This early sketch shows our desire to raise the building off the ground so that we could set the first floor above the height of the existing sugarcane fields. Lifting the building from the ground plane allows us to, of course, capitalize on the prevailing breezes from the southwest, and it protects the building from those floodwaters during the rainy season. This is a first and second floor plan of the building, and it was developed as a repetitive module for ease of construction. This is actually the main approach on the north-south axis, with a covered belvedere that gives you the view towards the volcanoes. To the left is a double-volume auditorium, and to the right is the reception with its necessary meeting rooms, beyond which is that large communal working space. which actually houses all of the employees. At the perimeter is a repetitive series of meeting rooms that are basically interspersed with a series of outdoor terraces seen here. These terraces align across the plan to allow the building to cross-ventilate, but also to provide expansive views of that landscape beyond. At the other end, you see a series of service spaces, loading docks, and bathrooms. And here you actually see an archive where the records and the kind of digital records, as well as some of the physical records of the company, is kept. This is a stair that serves as both a connector and, arguably because of its scale, a sort of gathering place. And it leads you to the mezzanine level above, which is seen here, a reading room, a cafe at one end, and a north-facing terrace that gives you an uninterrupted view of the volcanoes beyond. This is a series of analysis of the central portion of the building where we were analyzing desk arrangements, making references to that early research that we were doing. And we were looking at different ways to organize those desks, either linearly or in clusters, determining which would be the most efficient way of laying the space out, but also what those different arrangements might produce in terms of the working environment. These elevations these are actually a series of elevations in a section. And the elevations, generally speaking, are composed of large expanses of masonry walls. The lower section of the wall is developed as an exposed concrete finish with a martinelado or hammered finish. And it's punctuated by that repetitive series of deeply recessed spaces that serve as outdoor terraces between the meeting rooms. Large operable glass walls are set 12 feet behind the perimeter wall, and therefore the glass is always in a deep shadow. The upper wall finds its inspiration in the unadorned stuccoed walls of Guatemala's vernacular architecture. Here the wall is painted white with few openings at key locations in the building. And finally, a white metal roof figures the building against the skyline, culminating in a skylight that emits natural light into the main space. This is the final section with the double volume auditorium, the covered belvedere, the compressed reception area, kind of large volume for the main hall, the stair that connects one up to the second floor with a reading room and a cafe. These are the east and west elevations of the building and a cross-section through the reading room showing the relative thinness of the building within the precinct and the surrounding gardens. This is a view taken atop that elevated platform with the flanking gardens to the north and those recessed outdoor terraces seen here on the right. The elevation has very subtle projections, and I'll explain that in a minute, but here you can see the banding of the concrete below and the white stuccoed surfaces above. Lighting in this area of the world is a particular one. Being so close to the equator, the sun is almost always directly overhead. So as a result, very little surface projections can produce dramatic shadows. The overhead light directly influenced the design of the skylight, which is probably the most important kind of light-emitting element in the building. We limited the glazing of the skylight to the side walls and further protected it with a system of louvers to ensure protection from direct sunlight, which can be very, very intense. The effect is a diffuse lighting condition for the main hall that permits the interior to function with little to no artificial lighting for most of the day. This is a view of the main working space with the lower realm lined in wood and the upper mezzanine and ceiling painted white. This drawing depicts the proposed building in the context. We wanted the building to have a clearly discernible figure and a scale that could register against the vast tropical landscape. Our references came from both the industrial generic sheds of the area as well as the venerable Mayan pyramidal structures of the region. Drawing plays an important role in our work. I believe Adib and I are part of the last generation of architects, or maybe the transitional generation of architects that was principally trained by hand. The computer came into our repertoire of tools during graduate school, And today, we use these mediums interchangeably, depending upon the investigation or the desired outcome. I would like to say, though, that these drawings in particular are exploring a mix between hand and digital drawing techniques. And here, we're not only interested in depicting the building within the particulars of its geographic and cultural context, but we are also interested in the narrative of the drawing and depicting the scene at a precise moment in time. And so in this case, the building is drawn on the day of the safra, which is the cutting of the sugarcane. It is a day of great celebration where the large statue, and this actually happens, this is not a kind of figment of our imagination, but a large statue of Our Lady of the Rosary leads the festive procession through the fields. Our goal with these drawings is not to produce a photorealistic image, in fact, but rather it is a view that's inspired by multiple references, both in graphic design and in the fine arts. Similarly, this view is taken from the garden at sunset on that very same day, the first day of the cutting of the sugarcane. The sky has that pink glow of dust, and the flowers that are used on the day of the procession still lay on the ground. The horse in the distance is the only figure that remains after the inaugural festivities have ended. So while uniformity has become a global epidemic, and placelessness is now perhaps an integral part of our everyday lives, the projects that we have shown you here tonight are conceived otherwise. We are exploring the potential to create drawings, spaces, and even buildings of cultural specificity, where tradition and invention, the colloquial and the academic, the regional and the universal, participate in the composition and construction of the contemporary city. We wanted to just end on a short video. We hope that this will work with a little bit of sound because we couldn't take you to the Caribbean and without having a little bit of music. Let's see if it comes. That's our version of high-tech digital animation. Thank you.
Thank you for a very beautiful talk and beautiful work. And I think Louis Kahn might have enjoyed your talk. He doesn't always resonate with the people who bear his chair's name, but in this case, I think it works. So, but you didn't put his book in the pile. You're following another Yale famous professor, Harold Bloom, who says anxiety of influence, you always hide your actual source. That's a Kahn building, in my view. So shame on you. Caught. I'm sure we have some questions for you from the audience. Ed Mitchell, wait for the mic.
Given your thesis, when you take works of architecture that were Dutch moving to South Africa and end up in Miami, how does that become a context or an historic project to renovate? anything seems up for grabs in Miami. There is no history, it would seem to me.
Well, I mean, I guess there's always a level of fabrication in the built environment, right? I mean, everything is in one way or another fabricated, right? So the work that we were doing at the Dutch South African village, I mean, it clearly is exploring an architecture of thematization, right? And that's often a bad word today because you associate that with Disney World and a number of other things, but it's actually been...
It's all right.
But it's actually, no, because that's the first image that pops into one's mind, but this notion of a kind of constructed landscape has always been the kind of practice of the architect. So in that particular case, I would say that the context already existed, which in this particular case was the house, which was this kind of very small village that was thematized in this particular language. And so we had two ways of operating, right? We could say, we researched the drawings, realized that the building was incomplete, and we could complete it. Now, we could complete it in a completely different manner, a manner that would be staggeringly different from the original, which we could have. But maybe we chose the more radical approach, which is to say, we're going to learn from this architecture, and we are going to bring it back to a kind of completeness, at least a completeness as was originally intended by the original architect, and that we were okay with being anonymous. So we weren't necessarily we didn't make the stand of the critique of the original within this landscape, because we just take it as a given that it is a fabricated context, you know? So for us, the project was about just completing the original house in a way that we think often doesn't happen, because there's always the need to want to build the new in sharp contrast to what exists. And so here
But yet,
we blend
just
it
to
into
add
the
just to add one thing, they are actually different from those in South Africa, in fact, because what the architect originally did wonderfully was that he, in fact, transformed them to the realities of light and climate of Miami. So the stoop that would otherwise be exposed to the elements is actually here covered. It produces a very deep shadow. So it's part of this kind of context, as Carie says, that we live in Miami, you know, this kind of invented. In fact, we learned a great deal of how to deal with this by both having been in South Africa, and the clients being from there, but also by having seen the architecture of Curaçao, which is also part of our Caribbean context. In fact, the examples there appropriate some of this architecture. So that's how we felt kind of comfortable with it as well.
Could add one thing about that. Coral Gables, which you probably know, was said, is a completely planned town. And one of Merrick's ideas was to pepper, everything was supposed to be Mediterranean, but to pepper the soup with these different villages, including one that's Chinese, very timely, which was designed by an architect from Branford, Connecticut, and Yale, Henry Killam Murphy, who did many, many important buildings in China, Tsinghua, Beida, hosts of universities and churches and things, and he was therefore seen as an expert in Chinese architecture. So there is a perfect...
So that's very typical of 19th century architecture up through the 40s, right, where you have what we now see as contextual is radically uncontextual. It has nothing to do with it.
Well, it makes its own, because they make their own little villages within the bigger village. It's a fantastic concept. I don't think it's of the 1940s. I think it's of today. But we'll go on from there. There are questions. Kyle.
Thank you. You've said that your work is informed by a historical understanding without being historicist. Could you say a little bit more about what you mean when you talk about historicist in that context?
Well, that's a good question. I guess when we work, we don't approach a given project with already a kind of defined solution, if you will. And when we are looking at a surrounding context, whatever that might be it different areas of Miami or in this case Guatemala, I think that we don't have angst with looking at history. We don't have angst with thinking that architecture is a sort of autonomous discipline that we can actually learn from. And so we dive full force into the kind of research of that particular context or historical history, whatever the case might be. But then there's always a sort of transformation for us in the work, which hopefully was clear in the presentation, but where we operate in varying languages even, depending on the particular context, and we're not necessarily replicating any original. I mean, I think the one that perhaps takes us closer to a very in-depth study of, let's say, traditional or historical architecture is the case of the Cape Dutch, you know, where there we really are completing the unfinished work. But I guess we're operating within a kind of contemporary environment with no angst at looking at history as a source of reference. And then for us, the work is always somehow transformed by either client or program or even the contemporary methods of construction, so forth. I don't know if that answered your question.
Are you satisfied?
Maybe I could follow up. What would count as historicist? Like, what would you be trying to have? What kind of work would you be trying to avoid? It feels as if almost any architect could say that their work was in practice being transformed by contemporary conditions.
Well, I don't know if you wanna
Does
think
that
about
question make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess sometimes, I mean, the only thing I can offer is that, and again, hopefully the differing examples showed that, is that we aren't married to one architectural language or one particular style. We're actually willing to be informed by a given place in ways that are actually readily apparent when you look at the work, and not necessarily just said. So maybe we'll leave it there and discuss it over a martini. I don't know if I actually answered the question very well. But.
Not yet. Any more questions? Yes.
You very briefly mentioned that you've been studying informal settlements in different countries for a little while, which seemed really interesting. And I was wondering how long, why, when did you start doing that? And is that something that's informing your architecture? Is it a side project that you're doing? Like, where do you see that research going?
I can answer this question. So we actually came across this research from the academic side. We were actually doing projects in South Africa, more or less at the same time we were working on this house, and we went to document informal settlements in South Africa. And at that moment, we began to engage this, because we felt that it was very much in keeping with what we're interested in, which is vernacular architecture, the colloquial, the everyday life of cities, you know, the kind of folkloric dimension of a city. So we began to develop this interest in research. I mean, then we actually documented places in Mumbai. And then finally we realized that, you know, there are informal settlements all around us in the Caribbean, including a place that we know very well, which is Barranquilla. And so we decided to engage because of, as Carie mentioned, it was easy it's 2 hours. It's easier to get to Barranquilla from Miami than it is to get from Miami to New Haven, believe it or not. In 2 hours you're there, and you're within a completely informal city in many ways. And so we developed that research. We've been developing that research in the Caribbean, Barranquilla, and other places in the Caribbean, Cartagena. And it influenced the way in which we thought about that project that we showed you in Barranquilla, in a way, indirectly. And then currently now, these days, we're actually developing, we haven't shown you this, but we're developing projects for places like Barranquilla, at the level of the urban design, but most importantly, at the level of even housing. So thinking that the urban design dimension may be more interesting than the housing, which they seem, from our point of view, to have already kind of figured out. It's at the level of the infrastructure, the larger scale of the city, where things get a little more complicated and complex for them. So in a way, it's a kind of overlap. Both our research is both from the point of view of the academic, working with students, and then also from the professional point of view, now trying to develop projects for some of the cities, especially in Barranquilla. I'm not sure if that answers it.
The only thing I would add to that maybe is that most of the projects that we work on in studios at Miami are in Latin America, and whether we're working within a formal or informal context, let's say formal being like legal perhaps, one way to define it, it's always immediately adjacent to the informal. So when we were mapping our sites, inevitably the informal would actually find its way in. And what we realized is that oftentimes architects, maybe our observations were that many times architects that are working within these communities oftentimes eradicate, you know, the patterns of settlement that are already there. In mapping these places, though, we realize that they have very, very rich, even traditional kind of patterns of settlement. So, small lots, they press themselves up against the street. And what we also started to realize is that they're not all the same. So you can't come up with just one strategy for intervention. And so if you map, for example, Barlovento, the housing stock there is different than the one that we've documented, for instance, in Las Flores. Or you see different typologies that emerge, and you start to see that they're nuanced. But we were also able to distinguish kind of patterns that we saw. So just to give you an instance, like in Latin America, these are cities, of course, and are not being planned by architects, but nevertheless, they hang on to the street and block network, which is a kind of tradition of the colonial patterns of settlement. You don't see this when you map these sites, at least the sites that we've mapped in Africa, for instance, which are kind of tribal patterns where houses configure themselves around courtyards. So what we started to do was try to look at them kind of non-judgmentally and realizing that they have many, many problems. But what we started to notice is when we were working in these sites in Latin America, a lot of people would talk about them, but when you asked to see them on a map or when you asked to try to understand them, there's no evidence of them, obviously, because most of them are illegal. But the minute that we were mapping them and we were putting them forth, let's say for discussion, lots of different individuals from differing points of view and differing disciplines could talk over the drawing. And then, for instance, we had an instance where there was a civil engineer that for the first time could figure out where they would actually bring in the water lines because they could actually map it. So I think this is an ongoing research for us, and we're working with different areas or different departments at the University of Miami, but I guess it stems from our interest also in the design of cities. And we see this as like cities at their birth in a way, which makes it very, very interesting to draw them and to study them.
By the way, there's a kind of a very small engagement of the informal in our current studio here at Yale by a group of students who were documenting a kind of informality that takes place in Havana, in Cuba, and in which I think they've done marvelously, the documentation effort of trying to figure out how these informal architecture, in this case, takes place in Havana. So you can take a look at that as well.
Manuel wanted to ask the last question. That'll be a good one.
Oh my God, no pressure. I just want to bring up Silvetti and Machado just because there is something very surrealist in your work. I mean, you showed the moon here that but throughout the projects that you
moon over Miami, but it's Guatemala.
Right. But there's something also very Renaissance-like in your representations and also in the typologies that you use. It's all about setting up an urban stage, I feel. And for me, that is something very Silvetti-like. And since you haven't talked about him, I wonder if you could take a position in relation to his work. Silvetti is also from a particular part of the world and brought a sort of postmodernism to America that seems to be at the intersection between classical architecture and a very abstract architecture that seems to have something to do with the sun that you have in Latin and South America. What is your take on Silvetti, since your work and the way you talk about the cultural value of form in a place and the transformation that the architect triggers, the transformation of form that the architect has to oversee, is very close to Silvetti's ideas about architecture.
I guess I'll take that as a compliment. But I don't think I can answer for Jorge or answer anything about their particular work. He could probably do it far more eloquently than we can. Of course, we can't deny the fact that they were our teachers, both Rodolfo and Jorge were our teachers in graduate school, and of course we went on to work with them. And so, their ways of thinking about cities, resounded with us. But I don't know if I'm prepared to at least talk about Silvetti's or Rodolfo's work on their behalf.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting your comments because we've always thought that, in a way, the influence of Jorge's and Rodolfo's teachings on us is more at the level of the kind of handling of materials, and that's what we thought. I mean, in fact, we thought that these other things that you were talking about come from our studies at UM, at the University of Miami, in the context within which we developed in Miami. the kind of people that we've worked with, and in this, in the realities of coming out of a place like Colombia, let's say, and the culture of Colombia and Cuba in a way, and that we're kind of confronted with this kind of cultures, so.
Yeah, because I think that there's something about modernity in Latin America that doesn't abandon figuration. Frida Kahlo, lots of monkeys. I think that there is a certain degree of figuration in Latin America. So, the modern and the figured are not seen as kind of diametrically opposed, but they're really kind of in conversation with one another. So I think that, maybe that's what you see in the work. We're not afraid of the color, we're not afraid of the figure, we're not afraid of the narrative, we're not afraid of the flowers on the ground because they exist and they happen, and we're not afraid of the intense heat because it's there and you're sweating in it all day. I don't know, I guess that's all I can say about that.
No, in fact,
I think we'll sit on that, except the one point, Emmanuel. Jorge and Rodolfo are not from the land of high sun. They're from Argentina, which is like being from New England on the south. They're not comfortable with figuration and Mardi Gras. They're really uptight.
I'll make sure to let him know that you said that.
On that last note, I think we should thank our speakers. And please join them in the gallery for some refreshments. Wonderful talk.
It was nice to see your face.
You would never get invited back.
Wait until I tell Vince that you said he taught at Harvard.
Because he must be ever present.